Okay, hopefully that has resolved the issue. I'm experimenting with yet another new setup, so I hope that you can bear with me on this one. It sounds like we've got a bit of a solution here, though. Right, okay, there we go. We've got sound. Um, the problem with operating off multiple systems is that sometimes the system decides it doesn't like your microphone anymore. So here we go. Right, the purpose of today's stream is to talk about the bombing conducted by the U.S. imperialists of what was left of Yugoslavia in all the way back in 1999, 26 years ago, a foundational event for me in terms of my politicization. Probably the moment when I started to go in a somewhat confused direction towards anti-imperialism because my first instinct was to try and join the Socialist Workers' Party, which is never a good idea. But it was like the first sort of gropings towards anti-imperialism that sort of stirred in me back then when I was 17 years old. So it's quite a long time ago now. But here we want to examine why the US imperialists did what they did, but also the fact that the okay, so there's still problems with the sound. Uh, right, so let's just switch to hang on, let's try a different version. So that's now on a different mic again. That's on the camera mic. So hopefully that will sound slightly better. But do let me know if that's still a problem. So we'll continue, and I can take these things out of my ears if that's decent. The purpose of this is to explore the reasons for the attack on Yugoslavia and its historical significance. Now, the 1990s, looking back on it as somebody who grew up there, who grew up at that time, is a very strange decade because you can see now the the way in which all the narratives that are being deployed now in Ukraine were honed back then, and by one of the advantages of being older now is that I can clearly remember that the way that somebody like, say, Alija Izetbegovic in Bosnia or Franjo Tudjman in Croatia was presented is almost to the letter in terms of the propaganda, the same in way in which our old friend, the green-shirted coke fiend of Kiev, Mr. Zelensky, is presented today. It's exactly the same. The plucky underdog boldly defending his people against the marauding Slavic, fascist, Stalinist horde. And the same types of people were involved each time. Like if you go back and you look at the way in which, particularly the Bosnian War, was presented to the imperialist countries' domestic populations, play for play, it's the same, right down to like celebrity concerts from fucking Bono. I'm old enough to remember the U2 played in Sarajevo just after the ceasefire was signed, when the US knifed their old friend Izetbegovic in the back and made the Bosnians sign a far worse deal than was originally on offer 2 years before. But the same selection of political forces were involved. So, for instance, you had like the Trotskyites
running around in both 1995 and 1999 saying that they nominally opposed the war, but Milosevic was a terrible red-brown fascist who needed to be defeated. You know, same thing today with the Russian war with NATO on the territory of Ukraine. Oh, well, we realize that NATO is bad, but Putin is a gangster capitalist and needs to be overthrown. Same lines, same characters involved. If Christopher Hitchens was still around, he'd be still doing his act from 1995 when he was still pretending to be a revolutionary by supporting NATO bombing Serbia or bombing the Bosnian Serbs in 1995. But here we're talking about the 1999 bombing of Kosovo, though. Of course, you can't talk about that without talking about the previous events that led up to that. So here we're going to go into a little bit of the history first, and then we're going to come back around to talk about 1999 and what happened there. And the main book that I am referencing today is To Kill a Nation by Michael Parenti, which I think is one of Parenti's absolute best works and is really a handbook on how to counter US imperialist and British imperialist talking points, because the reality of what went on both in Kosovo and the wider Yugoslavia is spelt out there. Now, what I'm going to add into this is my own analysis of how Yugoslav Titoite revisionism helped set Yugoslavia up for destruction, because that's a point that Parenti doesn't really cover, but I think it's necessary to focus on that. So to go all the way back to the foundation of socialist Yugoslavia, 1944, following a brutal but very effective war against the Nazi occupiers and the Italian occupiers, the Yugoslav partisans and the Albanian partisans successfully evicted the fascist invaders from their countries. And this is a genuinely inspiring and heroic struggle. In this period of time, Tito, who would later go on to be one of the founding bastard fathers of revisionism, did play a genuinely heroic role, evading death on many occasions, fighting against the German fascist forces, the Italian fascist forces, and the local collaborators, of course, the savage, ruthless, criminal, gangster type elements, the Chetniks, the Bosnian SS Legion, of which, of course, the later president of Bosnia, Alija Izetbegovic, was a young man, and he was a member of the Bosnian Muslim SS Legion. The Croat Ustasha and the Serbian Chetniks, all of which the Yugoslav communist-led partisans battled against successfully. The Ustasha, of course, were some of the absolute worst criminals in World War II. The level of brutality and the monstrous nature of their crimes shocked even the SS. Like the sheer number of Serbs that they killed, the number of course, their own domestic opponents in Croatia, the torturing to death of partisans. They killed something like 1 million or so Serbs in death camps that were run by the Croat Ustasha. These were seriously bad bastards, right on the same level as Bandera and Shajkovic's boys over in Ukraine. These were some of the worst characters in World War II, and that is saying something. So that, and of course, at the end of the war, who gets the Ustasha leadership, particularly old Ante Pavlic, out of Yugoslavia? Why, it's the CIA and the Vatican working together, just like old times. And these reactionary forces, the Ustasha, the Chetniks in Serbia, the Bosnian reactionaries, these re-emerged later on, and we're going to talk a little bit about why they re-emerged. Now, socialism in Yugoslavia was always a truncated and compromised version of socialism. Whilst it achieved a lot due to the fact that it at least had a semi-planned economy, from the earliest period, Tito showed, for all of his heroism in World War II, renegade elements to his thinking. And these, of course, manifested in what's called the Tito-Stalin split. In reality, it's the Yugoslav common form split. And the split came about through the fact that Tito, in the leadership of the Yugoslav communists, had essentially fallen into an early version of Khrushchevite revisionism. They had gone down the road of a social democratic deviation and had decided amongst themselves that they should essentially try to sit in the middle of the Cold War conflict and essentially secure their position that way. And of course, in 1948, in through to the early 50s, when the revolutionary working class was still on the march, the imperialists were delighted to have Tito come over and collaborate with them, especially after Tito imprisoned all of the revolutionaries from the Yugoslav Communist Party as it was, and had many of them killed. So but then again, this is what revisionists always do. A revisionist always seeks to kill revolutionaries or imprison revolutionaries, and also demobilize and disarm the masses. And this is what Tito did. Now, I don't buy the arguments made by some that Tito was always a fascist collaborator. That is not true. Tito, it's perfectly possible for a character like Tito to have played a heroic and revolutionary role in one period and a renegade and reactionary role in another, which is what happened with Tito and the Yugoslav leadership. Now, what happened in the building of the very compromised, really social democratic form of socialism that was built in Yugoslavia was that there was a lot of flaws in that system from the very beginning. The industrialization of Yugoslavia turned into a truncated and uneven process. Like the core strength of Yugoslavia came from like Serbia itself, but this doesn't discount the heroic role that many Croats, Bosnians, and Slovenians and Montenegrins and Macedonians played. But the core strength was always in Serbia itself. And the industrialization process proved too uneven. Too many areas of like a place like Croatia and Bosnia remained very, very rural. There was some industrialization, but not enough to even out economic development. This was to lead to significant problems between the republics later on. The system of worker self-management that was lauded by Trotskyites and pseudo-anarchists and the Titoites themselves didn't lead to the masses playing a particularly active role in the governing of the state. It didn't strengthen the system in the way that, like, if you want to test the role of the masses and how strong that is, look at the systems that survived. So look at, like, especially those under siege. So look at People's Korea. Look at Cuba. Different systems to a degree, but the role of the masses in both is incredibly strong. The role of the masses in Tito's Yugoslavia was not strong, and that was true from the beginning. The worker self-management system activated some workers, but not to the same degree. Too much. If you look at the constitution or the various constitutions under which Titoite Yugoslavia was governed, you have all these incredibly complicated looking systems. But essentially, I would argue that by the 70s, you were getting more and more bureaucratic rule by a revisionist clique revisionist cliques, plural, shall we say, in Belgrade and in the republics, in the rest of the republics. And the Titoite revisionists, including Tito himself, were always playing with the constitution to try and balance the republics and the central government. And this created a level of, I would argue, constitutional chaos, which combined with a weak role for the masses and a very, very weak now, not a Yugoslav Communist Party, but the League of Communists, with very shaky, borderline non-existent connections to the masses. The League of Communists in Yugoslavia became essentially a bureaucratic institution which people joined for career purposes. Even the CPSU in its later stages was not as degenerated as the League of Communists in Yugoslavia. The CPSU in its later stages still had a strong working class base, albeit one that had been muscled out of political power by the end. It still had certain roots within the masses, but it was the leadership that was the problem. League of Communists in Yugoslavia was a pale shadow of a communist party and had been for quite some time, particularly after Tito and the Yugoslav revisionist leadership gutted its most revolutionary elements and had many of them imprisoned and many of them killed. Also, in the building of what was described always in the sympathetic literature in the West as like a mixed economy system or a more open system, in doing that, the Titoites followed a similar disastrous path in taking out large-scale loans from US imperialism, particularly through the International Monetary Fund. This started to happen from the late 60s onwards. And of course, the imperialists in the late 60s were initially delighted to do this because they knew what it would lead to. So they bided their time. And they waited for the revisionists' management of the Yugoslav economy to get worse. And then they started insisting, as they did in Poland, by the way, so there's some similar processes in play here. Poland also took International Monetary Fund loans in the early 1970s. And of course, the imperialists then were very careful to lean on the Poles and the Yugoslavs and focus, especially in the case of Yugoslavia, on removing any remaining socialistic elements so for instance, the very weak system of worker self-management that was done away with by the early 1980s at the insistence of the International Monetary Fund. And of course, after that, in where you have the League of Communists in Yugoslavia, which has very weak links to the masses, where they've not been developing the masses as the ruling class. They've not been carrying out. It was never a dictatorship of the proletariat. It was always a shaky combination of various different opportunist formulations. You don't have this mass base of workers and peasants who are willing to turn out and fight for the system. Some of them did want to fight to preserve the system, but the leadership at the leadership level, it's got all the same problems. I would argue even worse problems than the CPSU did, which is that revisionism is, if we can define revisionism, boil it down to anything, any single point, which is always dangerous to do. But let's just do this for a moment. If you had to define revisionism in one way, it would be a hysterical opposition to the role of the masses in the governing of the state and the exercise of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The revisionists are always the same in that they always seek to rule via bureaucratic clique, often dressed up in bourgeois slogans about democracy. And this is true of the Titoite revisionists. It's true of the Khrushchevite revisionists. It's true of revisionists anywhere. Again, look where the strongest nations that are still revolutionary and have survived are, and look at their systems. So, like the system in the DPRK has always sought to mobilize the masses in defense of the revolution, but also has always sought to politicize the masses. Now, one can have various different opinions about whether Juche is the way to go or not, but you cannot deny that since the days of Kim Il-sung, that the role of the masses in the DPRK has been incredibly strong, and the links between the Workers' Party of Korea and the North Korean workers and peasants have been incredibly strong, and that the workers and peasants play a very active role through the various different levels of workers' democracy and the proletarian dictatorship in the DPRK. Similar story in Cuba, albeit a slightly different system. The masses there are still mobilized on a regular basis. The masses play a role in the governing of the nation, a very strong role, which is why that revolution has survived. Where you've got countries which are vulnerable to US imperialist intervention, particularly Cuba, but also the DPRK, albeit the DPRK has some advantages in that, for all that the DPRK leaders have fallen out with the Chinese revisionists from time to time and the Russian capitalist class, neither the Russian capitalist class nor the Chinese revisionists wants to see the Workers' Party of Korea and the proletarian dictatorship there fall, knowing full well what US imperialism would put in its place. But if you, like Cuba, for instance, only survives because they have consistently succeeded at politicizing the proletariat and mobilizing them, by mobilizing it as a class to defend the revolution. Had that not been the case, had Cuba been as weak as as the revisionists in Titoite Yugoslavia, as the revisionists in Eastern Europe, then you would have gotten the same disaster in Cuba as you got everywhere else. And hopefully now, Cuba if the multipolar world is to mean anything, it means some of the pressure can potentially get taken off off Cuba. Who knows? If Donald Trump crashes the U.S. imperialism into the rocks, then the pressure might get taken off them rather quickly. But the point being that you have, by the 1980s, a serious series of crises afflicting Yugoslavia. You have the economic slowdown, which turned into a full-blown recession by the end of the 70s. You have ever-shifting constitutional changes. You have a depoliticized and increasingly alienated working class that is not capable of being mobilized by the League of Communists in a serious way. You have a leading cadre, of which Slobodan Milosevic was fairly typical, who were essentially bureaucrats, lawyers, and bankers. Now, Milosevic, will come to him in just a moment, but by the early 1980s, you're starting to see a perfect crisis develop and a huge. So imperialism, of course, US imperialism, was happy to use the Titoite revisionists to damage the USSR in the 40s, was happy to loan them a lot of money in the late 60s. And now the bill was due. The US imperialists realized that, well, we don't need these guys anymore. It would do us much better if we did them in. It would be much better to serve the interests of US imperialism to do these guys in completely, which is what, according to the Information Unearthed by Michael Parenti, Reagan signed off on 1984 with a National Security Council directive in 1984, identifying the destruction of Yugoslavia and its splitting up into its component parts of the different republics, a key national security priority for the United States. It's one of the most interesting things that Parenti turns up in his book, because what they did then was adopt a time-honored tactic of British and US imperialism, though it must be emphasized that German imperialism, particularly after the collapse of East Germany in 1980-1991, German imperialism was very much involved with this process as well. But the US was leading the way. And what they did was they insisted on, of course, a never-ending program of reforms, so-called reforms, that was designed to weaken the power of the Yugoslav federal government, boost the power of the republics, and enable the US and its allies to continually intervene in boosting the reactionary forces in Croatia, in Bosnia, in Serbia itself, and particularly like in the non-Serbian republics. And this is what they did all the way up to the early 1990s, when the US said, okay, well, you need to have democratic elections, and you've got to lift all restrictions on who can run, and we're not going to give aid to the federal government anymore. We're going to give aid directly to the republics. So they are literally starving the Yugoslav federal government of funds, and they're channeling money to the reactionary forces that were present then in the republics, so Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Macedonia, Montenegro. And it's in this situation that Slobodan Milosevic emerges. Now, Milosevic was a fairly standard Titoite cadre. He came from like the pro-capitalist side of the party, as if there was any other side by the end. And he was a man who was a revisionist, an arch revisionist, dedicated to like restoring capitalism fully in Yugoslavia. But he wanted to do it, and this is why he ultimately falls foul of the imperialist. He wanted to do it in a controlled fashion. He wanted to instigate basically some kind of like social democracy in Yugoslavia. That was what his agenda actually was. Forget the Greater Serbia thing and all the other guff that the imperialists talked. His actual agenda was that he wanted to essentially follow the Chinese route for Yugoslavia. And that is why he was demonized and ultimately driven to death or killed, depending upon which theory you believe. Now, in the early period of the Civil War that inevitably happened after the US had spent years fueling it, so they encouraged the breakaway of Slovenia. They encouraged the declaration of independence of Croatia. And Milosevic was actually consistently the one trying to make a deal with imperialism. He was trying to make a deal with imperialism over and over again in the early 1990s. So he constrained the Yugoslav People's Army commanders who wanted to roll in and crush the independence, the reactionaries in Slovenia and Croatia. Milosevic was doing deals with the imperialists, and he blocked the general's attempts to do that. Look it up. This is all true. Milosevic was the one who thought he could bargain with imperialism. He wanted to accept that Croatia, Slovenia, and most of Bosnia were lost, but wanted to hold on in Montenegro, Serbia, and reach an arrangement for the Serbian population in Bosnia. Now, what this, of course, led to Milosevic signing the Dayton Accords in 1995, and then thinking that he'd reached an accommodation with imperialism, started to try and sort out the economic issues in what was left of Yugoslavia. And this, of course, was not acceptable to the imperialists. They did not want any version of Yugoslavia to survive, because even a Yugoslavia that was truncated and consisted basically of Serbia and Montenegro was too much for them, because it's still even that state run by social democrats and revisionists and all kind of opportunists who were hanging around in the political system of Yugoslavia in the early to mid 90s. Even that was unacceptable to the imperialists. The whole thing had to be broken up, and it had to be asset stripped and reduced to the status of a neo-colony. That's what they wanted. Now, we'll get to the fall of Milosevic in just a little while. But these are the reasons behind the Kosovo War. It's nothing to do with the Kosovan Albanians. It's nothing to do with the dreadful Serb nationalist Milosevic, who was never that much of a Serb nationalist in truth. That was always wildly overhyped, if not an outright lie. And it's nothing to do with human rights or any of the other shite that they talked at the time. It's to do with the fact that Yugoslavia as a entity had to be destroyed under the terms outlined by the Reagan administration in 1984. It had to be split up into as many different component parts as possible, ruled over by comprador fascist cliques, like Croatia is, like Bosnia is. In Bosnia's case, fractured into different pieces. And this is what they wanted for all of it. And they wanted to break up Serbia itself, hence the focus on Kosovo. Now, Kosovo had been a problem for a while. In fact, there was long-running issues with the Albanian and Serb populations there, which the Titoite revisionists had failed to solve. And it must also be said that Enver Hoxha repeatedly intervened or tried to intervene ideologically, if nothing else, in Kosovo to support a sort of Greater Albania project. So that's a bad mark against Hoxha there as well, because regardless of however many correct points he made about the Titoites, fueling reactionary petty Albanian nationalism in Kosovo was a dreadful reactionary move and is a black mark against Hoxha's name. Now, the other point to emphasize here is that the KLA were essentially nothing but a group of drug dealers, gangsters, and various other lumpenized elements who were then chosen by MI6 and the CIA eventually as being their chosen implements through which they would try to further break up Yugoslavia. And the KLA, of course, started staging provocations in 1998. The British send long-term MI6 agent Paddy Ashdown, if anybody remembers him, former Liberal Party leader in this country, to go to stand on the border and look through binoculars at it and say, "My God, they're barbaric, aren't they, those Serbs?" And this was shown round the clock on British television. The agenda was quite clear from like late 1998 onwards that that they were going to try and rip Kosovo out of Serbia, and that was going to have a dual purpose of not just ripping Kosovo out of Serbia, but destabilizing the entire government headed by Slobodan Milosevic, and to damage him and to promote the growth of some petty Serb nationalists who would be prepared to essentially roll over and concede on every single economic point that the US imperialists, the British, and the Germans had in mind. Now, this is eventually who they found in a crooked, compromised figure called Kostunica, who was the man who was elevated into the presidency in the year 2000 in one of the first and most notorious color revolutions, headed by a Soros-sponsored group, NED-sponsored group called Otpor. More on them later. But the job of the KLA, as is the job of all of these reactionary lumpen organizations of criminals, was to stage provocations and begin a war. And that they duly did. And the war was designed to specifically justify the bombing campaign that followed. And I remember very well all the hysterical propaganda that was designed to whip up public opinion in support of a British-led bombing effort. Clinton was a bit more hesitant about getting involved with this. Apparently Hillary was a lot more keen. But Blair was the one who was leading this effort. Blair and the British clearly saw it as a way in which that NATO was going to justify its expansion. We've taken out the last elements of the socialist governments in the East. Now we can roll on and expand towards Russia. This was Blair's pitch at the NATO summit in 1999, NATO's 50th anniversary. I believe it was held in Chicago. And so the war was partly about destroying what was left of Yugoslavia, destroying Milosevic, but also it was about promoting NATO as this dominant force. And that's why the war absolutely had to succeed, and why it went on for the whole 78 days. Now, following the provocation staged by the KLA, of course, then we get the fake peace talks in Rambouillet in France, where the Serbs balked at a final humiliation. See, initially there was an agreement being reached. Then, at the last minute, the British and the Americans chucked in a clause which they knew Milosevic could never possibly agree to, which is that they demanded, as Parenti chronicles, complete freedom of movement of NATO forces across all of Yugoslavia, not just Kosovo. See, the Milosevic was, again, ready to capitulate on certain issues regarding Kosovo, where he was prepared to admit an international force into Kosovo itself, just not into the rest of Serbia, not into the rest of Yugoslavia. But essentially what the British and the Americans demanded of Milosevic, they knew he couldn't agree to it, was to essentially occupy the entirety of what was left of Yugoslavia. That's what they demanded. And they demanded that, knowing full well it would be refused. And then they could say, these evil Serbs have done it again. They've refused peace. And that was why they demanded it. This is kind of forgot. This was never talked about in the British media at all. It's still unknown by most British people to this day. But this is why they specifically staged that provocation so they could get the war underway, because that's what they wanted. Now they fought conceitedly, based on their experience of the Gulf War in 1991. If they just bombed Serbia enough, that would be it. But of course, it didn't work. And of course, one of the criminals who was involved in this was a certain Douglas McGregor, who now sells himself as some sort of multipolar analyst, in between calling for war on Mexico or saying that Zelensky is actually the bastard grandson of Lenin or something. But he was involved in picking out the targets on this. And as Parenti documents in his book, the targets were often not military. They were industrial facilities, agricultural facilities, media offices in one notorious case, the Chinese embassy in one notorious case, which was not an accident, by the way. There was some indication that that the Yugoslavs were using a broadcast equipment in the Chinese embassy, Chinese were sort of helping them under the table as much as they could, and that the US military bombed the Chinese embassy as a warning. Clinton, of course, denied all knowledge, but there's no doubt in my mind that it was absolutely deliberate. But after 78 days, the bombing wasn't working. They were trying to go after the Yugoslav army. It wasn't working. The Yugoslavs had still, even after all the weaknesses of the system had made themselves clear in the 90s, they still had a powerful army. that could have put up some serious resistance and could have seriously damaged any NATO force that tried to go in. And again, the NATO commanders, the military commanders, knew that very well, which is why after 78 days of continually bombing Yugoslavia, they hadn't made any real impact. They hadn't been able to drive the Yugoslav People's Army out of Kosovo. And so what did they do? Militarily they were failing. So who do they turn to? Why? It's our old friend Boris Yeltsin. Now Yeltsin at the time was locked in a battle with the various different elements inside what would become the Putin-led system. So came close to being impeached in 1998. He'd had a coalition government, including communist ministers, forced on him for a while under Yevgeny Primakov, who was a sort of old school, late period Soviet revisionist who was basically a representative of the Russian national bourgeois, and his role was largely taken over by Putin. Primakov's an important character in his own right. Maybe we'll come back to him in future episodes. But Yeltsin still had his hand on rather shaky hand on the controls. And so Clinton turns to Yeltsin to essentially sell out Milosevic. The key decision was made to try and force Milosevic to surrender by essentially getting the Russians to say, well, it's if this is still going on in the winter, we won't assist you with fuel or food. Basically, the Yeltsinites made it clear that they were prepared to sell out the Yugoslavs, and it was at that point that Milosevic realized that maybe we could argue about whether he was mistaken here. That he realized that the NATO would continue to bomb everything in sight, and that that NATO was desperate to avoid going in, but they would make the civilian population pay an incredibly heavy price if he continued to persist in defying the demands of the US imperialists. And so, knowing that the Yeltsinites had sold him down the river, and being promised Russian troops in Kosovo, Milosevic agreed to capitulate. A terrible mistake on his part, which he would pay the ultimate price for. Now, what you realize here is that the imperialists are displaying all the same weaknesses and barbarities that they always do, which is that they are very good at bombing civilians, bombing industries, bombing infrastructure. They're not very good at winning wars. And there was a lot of talk at the time, and I remember this very well, that, are we going to send in the US and the British armies to fight in Kosovo? And there was Blair apparently was periodically keen on this. Clinton was very much not. And they were trying to find other people to do the dirty work for them. They were trying to get the Hungarians to volunteer an army to go in there, because they knew that if they tried to go up against the Yugoslav People's Army on the ground, that they may win through sheer brutality in the end, but it would be incredibly costly and incredibly dangerous, because the Yugoslav People's Army was still capable. It had survived largely intact the bombing raids and had largely evaded most of the bombs thrown their way. So what would have happened had they actually sent an army into Kosovo would have been a potential military disaster for NATO, which they were desperate to avoid. And so Yeltsin, in one of his last big services to his masters in Washington, basically won the war for them. So what won the war for the US imperialist side in 1999 was not air power. It was not military power. NATO was revealed to be frightened and impotent, frightened off by the potential resistance of the Yugoslav army in 1999. What won them that war was Yeltsin. Yeltsin gave them the victory by selling out Milosevic, and that's the one of Yeltsin's rather charming legacies, which of course his successor Putin doubtlessly knows and understands, but doesn't talk about, because the Yeltsinites still have a fading and much weakened presence in the Russian system now, but they're still there, and Putin doesn't like to talk about that. There's also the factor of the KLA. We'll return to them now. Another element in the KLA were, of course, our old friends Al Qaeda. They were brought into Kosovo in large numbers, just the same way they're brought into every other Muslim related country, and unleashed, just the same way they have been in Syria, just the same way they were in Iraq, just the same way they are everywhere. They were a key part of the KLA's war on the Serb civilian population. And so ultimately, following a failed war but successful manipulation, NATO declared a great victory. And then they did what they were truly talented at, which is carry out their first color revolution. And this was done in response to the elections in 2000 in Yugoslavia, which were claimed to be rigged, though I've yet to see firm evidence that they were. And there were mobilizations against Milosevic, the same playbook unfurled itself, as it has done everywhere else. And what happened ultimately was that Milosevic was pressured into resigning by essentially a palace coup, which is the way these things always play out. The imperialists get what they want usually through a combination of sheer brutality, and if that doesn't work, through trickery, manipulation, and psyops. That's what happened in Yugoslavia. The Yugoslavs had weaknesses. It's doubtful whether they could have stood up against the full-blown war waged by the US imperialists, but it's doubtful whether the US imperialists themselves would have fancied the biting down on that particular bullet in taking on the Yugoslav People's Army had the Russians not sold the Yugoslavs out. Whether that war could have been successful, or whether it would have crumbled under political pressure in the imperialist core countries once the body bag started coming out, is an interesting question. Certainly, it's one worth pondering over for a while. But the overthrow of Milosevic basically meant that Serbia fell into the hands of pro-Western collaborators, including up to the present day with Vucic, who sort of balances between the two, or tries to appear as if he is, but is as he is in a line of very pro-US presidents. The fact that he gets denounced in the West is only because the West is so utterly rabid these days; they can't even accept a small verbal disagreement. And what you have is that all of Yugoslavia was delivered into the hands of the imperialists to be asset stripped, its industrial base destroyed, and its population turned into a source of cheap labor for the West. And Kosovo, of course, became free. In this sense, it was free to become a global center of arms trafficking, drug trafficking, people trafficking, sex trafficking, and organ harvesting. So that's the kind of people who run Kosovo now, utter gangsters in the pay of the US. It's also why the US has one of its largest bases in Europe, Camp Bondsteel. And a lot of the organized crime that runs through Kosovo, of course, has a very interesting relationship with the US authorities, in that the US authorities appear to collaborate with them. I think it's more than an appearance as well. So Kosovo reduced to a gangster statelet run by the scum of the earth. Yugoslavia destroyed, its constituent parts, assets stripped, its working class broken into 1,000 pieces. This is the legacy of the 1990s. This is the legacy of Mr. Blair, Mr. Clinton, etc. And if you look at like what was done to Kosovo, roughly it's the same thing that's being done to Syria now. Same kind of people doing the same kind of thing. And like I began this episode by saying, it is remarkable how many of the lines and the lies wheeled out in the 90s over Yugoslavia have remained constant. How many of the characters and reactionary forces that the imperialists use have remained constant and consistent all the way through up to the present moment. So if you understand what happened to Yugoslavia, you can understand what happens to Syria and to other places, because the agenda of the imperialists is always the same. Any state which is strong enough to offer the slightest kind of resistance absolutely has to be destroyed. Not only does the state have to be destroyed, but all of its industrial base, all of its technological base, scientific base, etc., which is why al-Jilani's men are roving around Syria killing loads of scientists. It's about destroying anything that could be used to resist imperialism, or anybody. And that's the story of the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. It wasn't that Titoite Yugoslavia presented this great threat to imperialism. It represented a slight barrier to the rampaging, rapacious US imperialists. And that is why they destroyed it, as identified as a priority by the Reagan administration in 1984. Right, okay. We will now take questions and comments from our audience. So let's see, who have we got here? We have Arcane Eclectic and Jerry and Daniel and Ian and Upac Chaos Jim. I hope I pronounced that right. From the Once and Future Yugoslavia, Agricola Urbanus, Irish Partisan, James Graham, Edward, who says, Labvakar Viedri. Good evening, comrades. Serbia is also run by a comprador clique. Vucic's good friend is Tony Blair. And there are NATO EU observatory bodies in every Serbian state institution. Well, there you go. Not a surprise, to say the least. Hello to Anthony. Hello to Caustic Grip, Tom Wolf, T.G. Wilson, Vera Robeson in Indonesia, Heidi in Edinburgh, Juan, Edward says, will a truly Marxist-Leninist Yugoslavia be born one day? Tito's Yugoslavia was not communist, sadly. Well, I have faith that one will be. Certainly there are many Yugoslavs in all of the republics who understand the failures of Titoism these days. Hello to Yepex, who says a Democrat Ukraine supporter called the Palestinian supporters Nazis and believes me a Nazi for supporting Dems and for criticizing Ukraine. Well, there's no limit to the delusions that people are prepared to engage in these days, is there? Or at any stage in history, really. Irish Partisan says, Franjo Tudjman was an open anti-Semite and openly rehabilitated the Ustasha. Izetbegovic was a Nazi collaborator. There's pictures of Izetbegovic in his fucking SS uniform. And this is the guy they fucking try to launder as the great defender of so-called human rights, Alija Izetbegovic, SS man. But then again, they've done it before, so why would they not do it again? Right, okay, let's just check in where we are. Okay, so we have 448 of you watching on X, so thank you to all those of you on there. 181 of you on YouTube, 1 on Twitch, 1 on Locals, 6 on Rumble. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Hello to Van Ice says, not quite correct. Tito's Yugoslavia had reached certain levels of socialist development. I would argue it wasn't socialist. Didn't have major shortages like most of the Eastern European countries had. Also, it had open borders. Well, the open borders worked out well, didn't they? Allowing all kinds of agents to come in. I mean, truth be told, and the worst, I've read about significant and significantly uneven economic development and economic problems in Yugoslavia by the early 1980s. It had at least as many problems as Poland, maybe slightly different, of a different quality, but at least as many problems, and had mortgaged itself to the IMF. So yes, I'm sure that many people in Yugoslavia, many workers in Yugoslavia, in the former Yugoslavia, look back on that time and think that it was vastly better than what is there now. And of course, that's true. That's undoubtedly true. But we shouldn't blind ourselves to the reality that the Titoites failed completely. And the center of that failure was their revisionism. Tim Gray says, evening, comrades. I remember being completely fooled by the propaganda of Yugoslavia. Now I realize what it's really about. Well, as long as we realize the mistake, that's the crucial thing. We all make them. It's just how we respond to them that matters. David Ball, hello to you. Daniel's got a hold of a copy of To Kill a Nation. Good starts there. Edward says, Albania followed Marxism and Leninism solidly until 85, yet still like Yugoslavia collapsed 5 years later in 1990? Why did Albania collapse and not continue like North Korea? Good question, Edward, and one that I would need to do more time studying the history of Albania. I'm going to defer on that question until I manage to read more about the collapse there. Yeah, I'm just not going to speculate because, again, I haven't finished my reading on it. Daniel says anti-communists will still like to portray Tito as the leader who stood up to Stalin. Yeah, well, that's why they loved Tito. It's like because he damaged the unity of the socialist bloc and was a source of revisionism and distortion of socialism for the rest of his life. So he went from being a hero to a renegade. Hello to Cyber Wanderlust. Hello to Abtin. Hello to Pablo Popova. John Paul II was connected to the Croat Ustashas, says Pablo. Yeah, well, what a surprise. John Paul II was a fucking fascist, a clerical fascist. There's no other way to describe him. Why the US loved him so much. Hello to Jawad. Hello to Ash. Good morning to you on the other side of the world. Hello to Rista. Kostadinov. Hello to Spurious Furious, the Pan American. Key lessons to be learned from Marxism and national question: never break up the masses along national lines. Well, I would say that, I mean, the constituent republics of the Soviet Union were on national lines. However, they were strongly bound into the center as well. So you had the republic set up, but you also had a strong promotion of a broader Soviet identity, which remained strong in most of the constituent republics of the Soviet Union right up to the end. Only really the Baltics and Georgia and Armenia was where it sort of fell apart. But again, like most of all of the Central Asian republics and Ukraine and Belarus and of course Russia itself all voted to remain within the USSR right to the bitter end. Rista Costadino says apparently Tito and Hoja were planning to make a deal about Kosovo before the Tito-Stalin split. Hadn't seen that one. AJ Williamson says Paddy pants down. Very much so. Rista Costadino says Rankovic was responsible for Kosovo until he was purged from the party, and during that era the Albanians didn't really like him. After his purge, Hassani did stabilize the situation, and Hoja's relevancy vanished in Kosovo. Lertis says clobber slobber. Yeah, that was the charming headline on the front page of the Sun. Irish Partisan says, in many ways, the Kosovo War is the blueprint for the subsequent US, British, imperial wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and now Ukraine, which has so many similarities to Bosnia. Yeah. Marista Costadino says, Milosevic really fucked up during the war when paramilitary organizations were allowed to fight. There were so many war crimes done by Arkan's Tigers. Well, the thing about it is, like, there were massacres and crimes committed by everybody in the Yugoslav wars. Like, there were crimes committed against the Serbs by the Croats and the Bosnians. Like, there was the massacre in Srebrenica, which was a massacre. There's no point denying that. It doesn't qualify as genocide, but it was certainly a massacre. And none of that is particularly fucking pleasant to deal with. But this is how it goes. It's worth emphasizing that Milosevic actually was post-mortem found not guilty of the crimes that were leveled against him by the War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which was a kangaroo court. Milosevic successfully defended himself before he died. Now, that leads some to believe that he was murdered because the case against him was basically going to shit. Agricola Urbana says, I remember how in 1998 I went through the main train and metro station, Berlin and Alexanderplatz. Hundreds of Kosovo Albanians were waiting at the platforms with baggage and a very aggressive attitude. Well, they were the Ukrainians of their time, you know. Let's have a look. Hello to Daft Tarzan, who's joined us. Hello to Albert. Hello to Mouse. Right, just scrolling through the comments here. Right, I'm just trying to find. Irish Partisan says, I recall an article by a former US military senior officer who wrote that had NATO launched a land invasion of Yugoslavia, it would have suffered 100,000 plus casualties and NATO could have collapsed. Yeah, it would have been a disaster. So, yeah, and that's no wonder that and they had to rely on Yeltsin to bail them out, basically. And Yeltsin dutifully did so. Hello to Svetlana, who says, during the Second World War, my grandfather was forcefully mobilized to go to the Srem front from Macedonia. He spent a year there. Schizo says, Dimitri Lascaris did a report from Serbia about NATO's war against Yugoslavia. Pablo says, I think in reference to my comment about John Paul II being a fascist, absolutely, he was. And I work in a school named after him, John Paul II. Well, yeah, well, this is who took over Poland after 1989, you know? Hello to Joplin the Great. Solidarity to you out in Tunisia. What's the counter narrative of the Tito assassination attempt by Stalin? Don't know, to be honest. I mean, I've heard these stories over and over again. Haven't seen enough to say either way at this time, though. Abtin says, it seems to me that the future of socialism is tied with the development of the total fall of revisionism and the Chinese project. Yes, interesting. Albert says, I look back with shame as I fell for the NATO propaganda. It is only in the last 6 years I managed to find my way out of the imperialist labyrinth. Well, you and me both, Albert. You and me both. Agricola says, I remember in my youth in West Germany, there were always often bloody family feuds between Serbian and Croat immigrants, which was not few. Slumbering Colossus says NATO's recruitment of Hitler's Wehrmacht should be known by everyone in the West, but it's known by barely anyone. Schizo says depleted uranium shells still cause cancer due to alpha radiation contaminating soil. A windy day could be deadly for children playing outside. Indeed, there's massively increased cancer rates in Serbia due to the depleted uranium munitions dropped on that place by the likes of Douglas McGregor and others. Agricola says, remember directly after World War II in the British sector in West Germany, the Allies kept up to 200,000 Waffen SS soldiers under pay, even allowed disciplinary executions. Yeah, well, I mean, that was the whole plan. They were going to try and re-recruit like a fascist army and turn it loose on the Soviets. They were convinced that the reasons why they didn't do that was because they were worried about domestic revolt if they did, given the high prestige in which the Soviet Union had amongst the workers of the West at the time, and also they were worried that they wouldn't win, which is why they were looking at nuking all the major cities of the Soviet Union. This is the kind of people who were actually in charge back then, same kind of people who are in charge now. They were more than prepared to try to completely destroy the Soviet Union. It was just that they were worried that they couldn't win. That's why they didn't do it. There's nothing to do with morality. Mouse says CIA is designed after Reinhard Galen's organization. Yeah, not a surprise. Arcane Eclectic says, "What are your views, current views on the Maduro government in Venezuela and the situation there?" Well, I'd say that I support the continuation of the Bolivarian revolutionary process in Venezuela. Maduro seems to be doing about as good a job as it's possible to do. He's made certain very good decisions, such as continuing to build the workers' militia and build the political education of the population in the working class areas. So I think he's continued some of the best elements of the Chavez era, and the fact that the revolutionary process in Venezuela continues to unfold says that things are generally going in the right direction there. However, we'd be foolish to say that they don't face problems. The US imperialists are going to be absolutely relentless in their attempts to destroy the Bolivarian revolution, and we can only hope that the masses and the government there are strong enough to stand up to it, because Trump and his gang are going to try everything possible to destroy them. So we can only hope, as I said, that the strength of the masses is there. They are well organized enough to resist, and that they have weapons in hand to do so. For if the lesson of the fall of Yugoslavia tells us anything, it's that when you depoliticize and disarm the masses, which is what the Titoite revisionists did, then you will find yourself destroyed very quickly by imperialism. Only the mobilization of, politicization of, arming of, and a consistent mobilization of the masses under the in defense of the revolution and the revolutionary process is what can save you when under siege by imperialism. There is no clever trick out of this. Aris Partizan says, in the DDR, they conducted a root and branch purge of ex-Wehrmacht officers who were tied to the NSDAP, unlike in West Germany. Yeah, in West Germany, they were promoted. Alistair Page McGill says, Pope John Paul II's successor, Benedict, was in the Hitler Youth. Yes, indeed, he was. I think he loved the uniforms. Let's have a look. Would Russia assist Maduro? Asks Slumbering Colossus. Well, they already have in many respects. It was under Trump's last term, his first term, that the Russians sent like I believe it was one of their heavy bombers over to Venezuela to essentially do a fly around and land. They apparently provided Maduro with like Russian security officers after there was some questions over his own security. The Russians are very heavily involved in Venezuela in terms of providing assistance to it. It's not talked about a lot, but they are. So it's it's not going to change either. I mean, no matter what, like Trump says, or like the occasional statement that comes out from Putin, and this is probably a good pivot moment to talk about like the latest developments here, like the Chinese-Russian plan for essentially building what's referred to as multipolarity. That plan is far more important and is far more durable than any bullshit non-agreement that the Russians and the Americans come to over this Ukraine thing. Because, as has been demonstrated many times now, the disaster in Ukraine is one that the U.S. imperialists are now trying to extricate themselves from, and they keep saying, "Oh, we'll have a ceasefire over energy systems," and then the Ukrainians, who are of course controlled by London and ultra-reactionary elements in the U.S. and Paris, say no. We'll have a ceasefire in the Black Sea, and then the Ukrainians say no. So the Ukrainians are not going to agree to anything the US wants to do. And if the US cracks the whip on them and says, right, you agree to this or you're fucked and we cut you off, then Zelensky's finished and someone will probably kill him. And then the Ukrainian state will collapse. Whichever way you turn with these negotiations, it ends in the Ukrainian state completely collapsing. Now you've got people saying that there's a massive Russian advance coming right up, and this is going to happen quite soon. And so, like the back and forth with Trump has been essentially a game played by both sides. it would seem that, judging from Putin's most recent statements, that the considered position of the Russian Federation is evolving to a point where they can see that, like, Trump is neither capable of delivering some kind of peace deal, nor does he really truly desire it. He just desires to extricate the US from the situation to make it look as if they haven't lost. The Europeans are desperate for the war to continue. The Kiev regime needs the war to continue, otherwise, many of its personnel will end up dead. Again, possibly including Zelensky himself. London has a death grip on the Kiev regime. If there was some kind of peace agreed, again, it would lead to a collapse. That's why Putin's doing things like saying, oh, I would agree to elections under UN supervision for the Kiev regime. He knows very well that the Kiev regime is not going to agree to any of that, nor will the Kiev regime's backers. They know very well, the Russians, what the game is here. And so they indulge Trump and say, oh, yes, we'll have this, this, and this, and we'll stabilize with you, and we'll agree to, open up diplomatic relations again, and we'll talk about arms control. But again, pay attention to the processes underway here. What are the Russians actually doing? Not just what they're saying. So what are the Russians actually doing? They have deepened their defense, mutual defense pact with the DPRK. They're deepening trade and technological and economic cooperation with the DPRK. They have a new agreement with Iran, which, whilst it doesn't say it's a mutual defense pact, the Russians have already been aiding Iran in terms of providing them with better air defense and better fighter aircraft, essentially making the task of the US, if it ever chose to try and launch a suicidal attack on Iran, becoming even more difficult. They've deepened the partnership with the Chinese, of course, and there's a whole joint strategy set out about multipolarity, which again is far more important and matters far more in the long term than anything Trump says or any twitch of the eyebrow that Putin gives. The reporting on this in the West is so completely demented, including by people who call themselves multipolar analysts, cough, cough, Scott Ritter, cough, cough, that it would appear that none of these people have read a single thing that Putin has said, or that the Chinese have said, or that the Iranians have said. This is the project to dismantle US power is much more serious and long lasting than the words of Donald Trump. Yes, the Russians will engage in the negotiations. There is a strong comprador element in Russia, which is weakened these days, but it's still very much there, that is part of the governmental system there. It's represented within it. It desperately wants to have negotiations with the US. They desperately want to get access to the Western markets again. But the fact is, they're not going to get any of those things. They're not going to get any of those things because the US ruling class is in a real divisive battle amongst themselves over the way forward. The Europeans are desperate for it not to happen, for the end of the war not to occur. And so things will just rumble onwards. And I have stated this for a long time. The Russians will continually negotiate with the US about one thing or another. But in the end, they have already reached the conclusion that there will be no negotiation with the Kiev regime. The Kiev regime either fights to the death, not its death, but the death of all the Ukrainian men, or it dies. Because again, as soon as an agreement is signed, the Kiev regime will collapse in on itself. The only thing that's keeping it together is the war, and it's just a question now of like how the Russians choose to finish it off, knowing now, as they do now, that the Europeans and the British will never agree to cut the Kiev regime off. That there's many elements inside the US state machine that don't want to cut the Kiev regime off and want the war to continue. And they don't want to be seen to have lost to the Russians. So things will continue. Right. Schizo says, my great-grandfather took part in an Operation Iskra and helped liberate the Baltics from Nazism. Now I wonder if it was for nothing. Well, it wasn't for nothing, because it destroyed Nazi rule there and liberated the people. The failures of revisionism are not the failures of those who fought and died in the Great Patriotic War. They are the failures of those who unfortunately survived to hold positions of power in the CPSU. The Great Patriotic War is not diminished or demeaned by the legacy of Khrushchev and Gorbachev and others. It is the Great Patriotic War and the victory there are a testimony to the revolutionary power of the Soviet Union and the Soviet masses in that time, surviving an assault that would have killed almost any other nation in the world at that time. So no, it is not diminish or demean their victory. It only shows that one must always be completely ruthless with extirpating revisionism, because revisionism dresses itself up in this dresses itself up in the language of humanity, democracy, human feeling, humanism, all the language that Gorbachev used, and relaxing the dictatorship. But in reality, what it is, hiding behind all those pleasing bourgeois words, are the reality of bourgeois rule, which we saw in the restoration of capitalism in Russia, which means the mass death of the working class. And that's what revisionism ultimately leads to. It leads to the removal of the working class from power, the restoration of capitalism, and unmitigated horror on a mass basis. And so when you get a revisionist, as you often do, saying to people, well, we can't possibly do the kind of things that those dreadfully repressive regime, that the dreadfully repressive and mad Koreans do, or we can't possibly do the kind of thing that was done in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, or we can't do what was done in the purges in the 1930s. What they mean is, and you can throw the Yugoslav revisionists into this as well, what they mean is we don't want the masses to be mobilized against us. We want to be free to govern the country, not freed from the scrutiny of the masses. We want to be free to restore capitalism and lead a good life and line our own pockets. That's what the revisionists want. And they dress all this up with the language of human rights and dignity and velvet revolutions and socialism with a human fucking face. Honestly, if I have one more person tell me about the human element whilst being the most anti-human people you could possibly imagine, I will fucking shoot somebody, because this is the way they dress themselves up is sickening. They always go on about, oh, you Marxist-Leninists don't understand the human element. What they mean is, and go back to Mao's combat liberalism, what they mean is they want to be freed from the dictatorship of the proletariat. The revisionists are usually bureaucrats who want to be freed from the scrutiny of the masses. That's what they mean. That's what it all comes down to in the end. And yes, they trick some people into joining them. But my God, what horrors revisionism has wrought upon the world, what horrors it has brought to the working class. And they still dare to talk about socialism with a human fucking face. The only face that revisionism has is the twisted and contorted and corpulent face of Gorbachev. That's the one that it deserves to have. Okay. Okay. Have I seen the young Karl Marx yet? Asks Slumbering Colossus. No, I haven't seen the whole thing, in actual fact. I will make a note of it to actually watch it. Joplin the Great says, listening to the Stalin and the Opposition series, amazing trove of red pills, especially at number 4, the statistical insights of Stalin with the proportion of state employees actually being in the party. Yes. Do you have an opinion about Putin's speech and the developments of the Arctic? Asks Judith. Trump is also interested in the north, in the far north. It's his capitalism's new frontier. Well, look, I mean, this is another thing where like people say, "Oh, well, the Russians want to collaborate with the Americans." The U.S. imperialists don't want collaborators; they want slaves. In the case of the U.S. Ruling class in Florida, they want child slaves, as it turns out. Just to go look at their plots to relax so-called the child labor laws. So they're not going to get joint cooperation and development with the Russians. The only deal that the U.S. imperialists will ever accept is one that gives them everything they could ever possibly want and subjugates their opponents on the way. So this joint development of the Arctic isn't going to happen. You'll get joint projects between like BRICS countries. You won't get them with the US and the G7 bloc. they'll try and seal off what they think are their bits of the Arctic away from any collaboration with the Chinese or the Russians. So Putin can make these speeches, but in the end, like, development of the Arctic is going to be mainly a Russian, Chinese, and BRICS concern. The US, of course, sees things in terms of being able to exploit or hyper-exploit minerals and defend its interests and stop the Chinese and the Russians getting access to places like Greenland. By being so crude and over the top, though, Trump might end up pushing an independent Greenland in another direction, towards like China or Russia, because like being ruled over by the decaying corpse of US imperialism personified by Trump and his team of idiots and sycophants. And let's just talk about this for a second. Trump's team is as stupid as the Biden team. And I'm not just talking in terms of like qualifications, in terms of like basic ability to analyze a problem. Like when JD Vance, who's an idiot, is your version of like an intellectual, you've got severe problems. Why on earth are these people fucking running chats on the Signal app? Is it because they wanted to leak something? Well, maybe. I think it's more the point that these people are fucking stupid. Like Pete Hegseth is a drunk idiot. Like Mike Waltz, he's an idiot. Marco Rubio is an idiot. Like, these people are incredibly stupid. This is like the bottom of the barrel. This isn't even the second 11. This is like the third, fourth, or fifth 11 for US imperialism. The fact that they've turned to these people and allowed them into positions of power, and when they can't even do basic things properly, tells you that the US imperialism is in a very, very deep crisis. Vance looks like a drug-addled nightclub owner. Yeah, Vance looks like the kind of guy who you would find in a nightclub booth at like 2 a.m. He'd be completely off his face on like coke or something, and he'd like be wearing perhaps a shell suit, and he'd be talking to you very, very quickly and urgently about some great business idea that he'd got, and he only needed startup capital of £5,000. And if you get it to him tonight, he can guarantee you a share of the business of at least 82%. With a guaranteed profit margin of 70% in 5 years. £5,000, maybe I could let you in for 2.5. Maybe I could let you in for 500 quid right now. Can we get some more coke? That's who I always regard JD Vance as. All right. Okay, so we are coming up to just 5 minutes past 9. So I'm going to draw things to a close for this evening. Thank you, everybody who tuned in tonight. I will be back with you again tomorrow, and with a program yet to be announced, but it will definitely be something. So I think what we'll do tomorrow actually is a more in-depth look at Putin's recent speech and a more in-depth look at Ukraine, because that needs to, we haven't done something on that for a while. And then, of course, join me on Monday at 9 p.m. For our Monday Q&A as well. All right. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thanks, everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Audio uploads to follow. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I'll be back with you again very soon.